over there. There are refreshments available, coffee, water, wonderful treats, so please help yourself to those throughout the evening. I do want to, before we start, alert you to some upcoming opportunities, which are on the golden sheets on your table. We have a women's event coming up on November 8th with Susan Stabile on recognizing and respecting the giftedness of women. It is free of charge, but reservations are required. And then we will be having Archbishop Bernard Hesta join us on Monday, December 17th for an Advent evening of reflection. So those are two events that we're looking forward to hosting here at St. Paschal's. A couple other things on your table, white forms, evaluations. If you've come to these events, you know that we like to have evaluations. They help us, the committee, in our planning because we really want to meet the needs and desires of those of you who are coming to these events. And also there are green forms. The Adult Faith Formation Committee is really thinking that this is an initial conversation. And so after the presentation tonight, if there are some of you who might be interested in continued conversation, if you would fill out one of those green forms and turn that in to me, we will see about setting up some groups for conversation on the art of accompaniment. So finally, it is my great privilege tonight to welcome Matt Reichert. Matt teaches at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. He is a frequent workshop leader. He has presented across the country and at the National Association of Pastoral Musicians and the National Catholic Education Association conferences, the Mid-Atlantic Congress and the LA Religious Education Congress. He hosts the National Association of Pastoral Musicians Ministry Mondays podcast and co-hosts the critically acclaimed Open Your Hymnal podcast. He also co-directs the One Call Institute, which is dedicated to the formation of young people in the church. So welcome, Matt. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think it's appropriate to be here at a parish where your patron is Paschal Valen, talking about the art of accompaniment, because I think St. Paschal is a good model of accompaniment if you know much about St. Paschal's life and the way that he interacted with others, especially early in his vocation before joining the religious community. I think he's a good model, so in a special way I think he's our patron tonight for this conversation. As Kim mentioned, I teach at St. John's and St. Ben's. I'm housed in our philosophy department. I am not a philosopher, so I don't know what sort of punishment being housed in the philosophy department is when you're not a philosopher. But I did my graduate studies at Notre Dame in education, but my research interests are in Catholic education, in generational changes in the church. I have a sociology background, and so what I teach at St. John's and St. Ben's is critical thinking seminars. I also teach a lot of different social theory, and as it applies in religious and educational contexts. So tonight you're going to get a double dose of the things that I typically teach, and I hope that that's a good thing. So here are the objectives. In a short amount of time, I am going to begin to scratch the surface on a very critical topic of accompaniment. So my goal tonight is to help define what accompaniment is and what its roots are, so we can understand sort of the basis from which accompaniment comes. To also explore this concept of accompaniment along with the twin concepts of conscience and discernment, because all of these, while sometimes we talk about them as separate concepts, they're really interrelated in such a way that we can't understand one without really understanding the others. And then I want to begin to sort of fill in some of the understanding of what accompaniment is by applying it to a pastoral concern, or an area of pastoral concern within the church. There's a lot of talk about accompaniment, and as it relates to pastoral considerations like divorced and remarried Catholics, or families in irregular situations, right? So there's all kinds of conversation about that. And we might get there when it comes to time for questions. But I want to apply a different lens to accompaniment with an additional critical need in the church, and that's specifically looking at the role of young people and young people's relationship to the church, or more often than not, young people's non-relationship with the church, and how I think accompaniment can fit there. And then hopefully we will have time to answer questions, but my goal really is that we will create more questions about accompaniment and what it means for you individually as people of faith, but also what it means for you as a witness community here in St. Paul. These are all of these sources, don't try to remember all these already, these are all the sources that I'll be drawing from in some sort of way or beginning to direct you toward. And let me say something just about a couple of these, right? If you are not familiar with Amoris Laetitia, Evangelii Gaudium, or Gaudium et Spes, those of you who remember your Latin, Gaudium et Spes is one of the great documents of Vatican II on the church in the world. Evangelii Gaudium is Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation on the joy of the gospel, and Amoris Laetitia is the joy of love. I strongly encourage you to read them. They are available online for free in English, and they are incredibly accessible. Right? So this is not the nerdy academic telling you to read the Latin title thing. It's beautiful, it's challenging, it's rich, and I encourage you to read it. So everything I'm talking about is not to replace your reading or understanding of these things. It's to hopefully whet your appetite enough that you go and read them. So I strongly encourage you for those three, again, on the church in the world, joy of the gospel, and joy of love, to consider this. All right? So I'm going to begin with a story. Typically, when people think of accompaniment, all sorts of musical metaphors are used, right? Because we think of accompanists as, you know, the people behind the keyboard for the person who's playing an instrument or singing. So this is one of my, as a musician myself, one of my favorite musical jokes, but I think there's a little bit of truth here, or a little bit of ouch here when it comes to accompaniment. So there is an orchestra rehearsing for a big concert, and there's this big soloist in town, right? Think of, you know, one of the three tenors, kind of somebody who's got a bigger ego than you can imagine, who's a world famous tenor, and they get there and they're rehearsing this major piece, this major song, and at the end of it, the conductor stops and says, "Orchestra, a couple of notes. Measures 3 through 5, instead of in 4/4 time, it's now 3/4 time. Measures 20 through 25, instead of in the key of D, it's now in the key of E flat. And from the middle of the piece all the way to the end, any of the high notes, play them a half a step lower." And the soloist says, "Well, do you have any notes for me?" And he says, "No, sing it exactly the way that you just did." Right? Because the singer was not singing it the way they should have, and he's adjusting the orchestration to the singer, right? When it comes to accompaniment, oftentimes we think of accompaniment as being permissive, right? We think of accompaniment as being enabling, and nothing could be further from the truth. When we're talking about accompaniment, we're not talking about changing the score to fit the singer. We're talking about all of us together singing and playing the same score and coming to mutual understanding. So I hope to unpack this metaphor a little bit as we work our way through. So first, the context, the roots for accompaniment, where this comes from. I promise to not give you a lot of history, right? But there's some history here that I think is important, so you can understand, especially Pope Francis's emphasis on accompaniment, where this comes from, and sort of the font of where he's finding this information. So if you consider this timeline of the church, right? This is a pretty condensed timeline for 2,000 years, but here it is, right? And if you consider this founding period up until the point when Christianity really becomes a major official religion, If you consider Jesus' ministry and some of the themes and trends of what's happening, Jesus' focus on encounter, Jesus' focus on people of mercy forming people's consciences. When you think of the early church and you think of Christian communities accompanying each other, you think of some of the scripture passages from the Acts of the Apostles of what these first communities were. We really see the seeds of accompaniment there. And sort of historically, and I am not a theologian, but I play one on TV. I'm not a theologian, but so this is not a theological concept here, a construct. But if you look at what happens in the early years of official Christianity, the way the church operates moves more toward a legalistic, minimum level of participation structure once we sort of become official religion in the empire. And I don't say that to be critical, I say that because there's a very different feel to the way the church operates a few centuries after these first Christian communities. So we have baptism without formation, without prior formation. Right? We begin to have less emphasis on personal faith, more of an emphasis on membership as opposed to that personal faith. We tend to have a lot of rapid growth in the spread of Christianity throughout what was then known in the Roman world. Right? We have more of an emphasis on obedience to law. There were very few obligations. There was more fear of hell than there was emphasis on obligations. Right? And so in terms of conscience, in terms of conscience, our conscience is down there. In terms of conscience, this has now become the point of primary emphasis. It's important, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily where the first sort of emphasis goes in the early church. Right? And eventually over time, as the church begins to develop, and we have other reforms, and we have other councils, our understanding of the way the church operates starts to shift a little bit. Of course, we come to the sort of tipping point here in some ways, one of the big paradigm shifts, and that's with the Reformation. And now it's important for us to understand the Reformation, and for a variety of reasons. This coming Sunday is Reformation Sunday, the 501st anniversary of the Reformation. When we think about the Reformation, for our purposes tonight, it's more important to understand our response to the Reformation. So our response to the Reformation, in the councils and the meetings that follow, especially in the Council of Trent, sort of doubles down in some ways on what had been developing in the early centuries of the church once we're an official religion under Constantine. So we start to get to a point where there's no reconciliation here. I don't mean reconciliation in terms of a personal matter, I mean reconciliation within the Reformation. Right? So we have a pretty firm split now. And so the Council of Trent starts to set some of these boundary stones. Some of the early church writers and commentaries on the Council of Trent refer to these as boundary stones. So we're reforming abuses within the church, some of which brought about the Reformation, but we're also doubling down on the way we respond to people's behavior, what's expected, emphasis on the law, because we had to. Right? It makes sense when you consider what the Reformation does to the church, for the church in Europe, that it makes sense we go to this doubling down of the law, of calling out, exposing, condemning heresy, whatever that might be. Right? So that's sort of what the Council of Trent begins to institute in a more concentrated way. Right? And this more or less continues, I mean there are other changes and things, right? This more or less continues into Vatican I and right up to the middle of the last century with Vatican II. So once we get to Vatican II, we see this move past a revised Code of Canon Law, right through a liturgical renewal into Vatican II, where now what we're doing in Vatican II is trying to go back to the earliest church, to rediscover the way the earliest church operates, and to bring some of this back towards us living in the present, living in the 20th and now the 21st century. So the reason I say all of this is because accompaniment as a pastoral strategy is a continuation of the work of Vatican II, But lest we think of this as something new, a new invention, this is also something that is in concert with and a continuation of some of the earliest approaches and practices that we had within the church. So this is in continuity with Scripture, apostolic church, previous councils, popes, and it's open to the development of doctrine in two really important ways. These Italian terms of aggiornamento, which was the big emphasis, one of the big emphases in Vatican II, the opening, right, throwing open the windows, letting the fresh air come in, this aggiornamento, but also resourcement, going back to the source. So we're applying in new ways something we're rediscovering. So again, the reason I'm taking, the precious little time we have here to emphasize this is what Pope Francis is doing in emphasizing accompaniment is in some ways new for us, but really the emphasis is being renewed. The concept is not new. And it's going to be my argument tonight that accompaniment, sorry about the lowness here on the screen, that accompaniment is the pastoral strategy, one of the pastoral strategies that we need most right now. Locally, universally, personally. Okay? So that's the historical context. All right? So now we'll get into the meat and potatoes here. I'm going to give you the definition, but before I give you this definition, I'm going to invite you to consider just for a few seconds to yourself the following questions. So this isn't meant for conversation, so just internally, I want you to think about in what ways do you experience God speaking in your life? Where do you hear this voice? How in turn do you respond with that communication? So take 20 seconds for you to think about these questions. So the reason I ask you to consider this is because we as a church believe that God speaks to us in a variety of ways, right? And some of these ways might have been things that you were just thinking about. We certainly know or believe that God speaks to us through Scripture, through the liturgy, through the mysteries of the church, and through incarnation. The Word was made flesh and dwelled among us, those moments of daily life where there's that little glimpse of the divine. Through community, through dying and rising, right, through all those mysteries. Certainly in the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the way we experience those in others, the way we live out those gifts, the witness of others, our relationship with others, in nature, in beauty, in music, in art, right, in quiet and solitude. I have 4 children, ages 7, 5, 3, and 1. How I long for solitude. So we know that these are the things that typically come up when we talk about where do we hear the voice of God. It's less important where we hear the voice of God than we are all on the same page, that we understand theologically, spiritually as a people, that we believe God is still speaking. Right? God didn't quit speaking 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, but that today, in 2018, the voice of God can still be heard. And we also know, however, that we live in a very modern, noisy world. So we have noise. We have the news cycle. Right? It's noisy, right? We have peer pressure. We have societal pressure. We have competing ideologies and philosophies that compete for our attention and our energy and our understanding. This is especially impactful on young people. So one of my areas of interest is in cognitive development, cognitive psychology, and even taking up sort of religious views, spiritual formation, etc. If you look just psychologically, the impact on children especially, whose brains are still developing with this type of noise is significant. There was a study that was done about 10 years ago. So that just means that this has gotten worse. But 10 years ago, the average young person under the age of 18 is exposed to 3,000 marketing messages per day. Now that seems crazy, right? But when you consider a marketing message is a TV commercial, but it's a billboard, it's a logo on your backpack or on your shirt, it's a radio ad, it's all of these things, right? 3,000 per day. And if you think about what marketing is, it's a way to convince you to be a certain person or adopt a certain lifestyle or feel you need a certain product or to project a certain image. So in a sense, 3,000 times a day, we have children, and us too, who are being told to fit in, to change, to adapt, to live differently. That's a lot of stuff, right? So we know there's a lot of noise. So what accompaniment is basically a way for us to try to figure out how God is speaking to us. We know that God is still speaking. We know that sometimes, a lot of the time, we need a lot of help hearing what that is. And so therefore, we have accompaniment as a critical pastoral strategy. At its heart, accompaniment helps us cut through that noise to figure out what is of God and what is not. Seems pretty simple, right? It's going to get a little more complex than that, I promise. So, here's a definition that sometimes gets used or commonly is the basis for accompaniment. We talk about accompaniment as help given by one Christian to another, which enables that person to pay attention to God's personal communication with him or her. Seems pretty simple. Oftentimes, this is a definition that's also used for spiritual direction. It's important to note that spiritual direction and accompaniment are not always the same thing, but they're closely related or correlated. Right? So accompaniment works, now again, I'm speaking theologically here as a non-theologian, but accompaniment works only in the light of grace. And this is important to understand because when we are being accompanied, when we are accompanying others, the words and actions that we're taking cannot be our own. And what I mean by that is that if we don't cooperate with grace, with something else that is not of our making that is happening, we run the risk guiding others in the way that we think they should do things, or the way we would prefer things, according to our viewpoint of how things are structured, and that's not what we're trying to do. We are not trying to enable another person to pay more attention to our personal communication with him or her, as nice as that would be from time to time. Instead, we're trying to, again, enable them to pay attention to God's personal communication. So, this is the danger, of course, and this is the temptation with accompaniment, is it's hard sometimes to understand what is our voice, what is it we think they should do, what is it we believe, what is it we want, and what is it that God is calling them to. Say more about that in a minute. So at its heart, accompaniment is calling us or leading us to be the people that God creates us to be. And in this common, constant communication that we believe exists, even to this day, this voice of God, the message that God is sharing to us, that we hear that and that we respond to it. Okay? So here again is our operative definition. And to add to this, it's one thing to hear, it's another thing to now consider accompaniment as a response. This is a response to a personally communicating God, and then we need to live the consequence of that relationship. So this is what I mentioned before. A lot of times, critics of accompaniment will feel that, well, this is just enabling. If you say to somebody, what do you think God is calling you to do or to be? Well, I don't think God really is calling me to go to church. I think God is calling me to just walk in the woods and be a nice person and not eat too much candy and to not be mad in traffic. And I think that's what God is really. Well, is that what God's voice is telling you, or is that what your voice is telling you? Right? This is not enabling. It's cutting through all of that to figure out what really is of God and then to respond to that. Right? The difficulty with this, Cardinal Maradiaga is one of Pope Francis's group of 9 cardinals who have been meeting over the last several years of his pontificate. He's from Central America. And I think this is a helpful quote because it sets up this difficulty, the central sort of tension here. An authentic pastoral accompaniment means always walking with a person, knowing that whatever road they walk, it leads to heaven. There's the push and pull that's happening here. In accompaniment, we commit to walking with a person, but also letting go of our own demands of that person, our personal demands of that person, to find God's demands of that person. That's a difficult balancing act, as we'll see. So here's one of the challenges when it comes to accompaniment. Walking with others is one thing, hanging out together is different. Just going to lunch together is not accompaniment, unless that going to lunch together helps fundamentally orient a person towards God, or helps a person directly, intentionally try to listen more closely for God's voice. So being a good person, being a nice friend, being a non-confrontational person, when I say non-confrontational, I don't just mean non-aggressive, or we shouldn't be aggressive necessarily, but non-confrontational person is not really what we're being called to do, right? Going to happy hour isn't necessarily accompaniment, if only that were true, right? If only lunches and happy hour or a pastoral ministry happened, we'd be full all the time, right? Depending on the food, I suppose. So our task is not to affirm everything. Accompanists don't affirm everything. We invite. So this is in the example I gave before of the singer. Now you sing it exactly the way you did, and we're going to change the tune. That's not it. We're not about changing the tune, right? But we are about committing to the person and walking with that person. So walking with only becomes accompaniment once we add, and this is key, the intentional desire to lead others closer to God. So there has to be that intentional desire, not just the commingling. This is where it can be difficult in a lot of parish ministry, and I'm sure this is not the case here, but in a lot of parish ministry where there's a lot of social outreach and there's a lot of community building and a lot of togetherness building, and that is wonderful. But if it doesn't get down to the intentional leading and orienting towards God, then we're not accompanying. We're just sort of standing side by side. We're lunching. We're not accompanying. So that's one of the central challenges. So this is directly from Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. Evangelii Gaudium is a fairly long document. There's a section right in the middle that's like 8 or 9 paragraphs that specifically deal with accompaniment, right around paragraph 170 to 179 or so. And so, forgive me for reading it here, but without this orientation toward the desire of God for us, we quickly become drifters in a world lacking meaning. We become spiritually homeless. Walking with each other without calling one another to the heart of God is counterproductive. It's a sort of self-absorbed therapy, but it is not a pilgrimage to the Father. This can be pretty biting and pretty challenging, right? As we consider what are the ministries we do, and when I say ministries, I mean official things we do as parishes, but I also mean our ministry in terms of how we relate to our family, our friends, our neighbors. If we don't have that type of walking with each other, it's self-absorbed therapy. We want pilgrimage, not self-absorption. So, we ask the question, whom do we accompany? And then we'll apply this to a couple of things, and I think some of this will start to emerge perhaps more clearly. So when you think of all the people who you quote-unquote walk with in your daily life, or you spend a lot of time with, you interact with, there's a mutual sort of relationship. Certainly you think of parents and children or other family members, spouses, co-workers, perhaps neighbors, that type of thing. And so when we consider how do we walk with these people, not just how are we around these people, how are we nice to these people, how do we be good Minnesotans where we don't really stir the pot so that we don't create any sort of conflict or that kind of thing. Not think about that so much as how do we walk with each other, how do we invest in each other, how are we intentional in our relationship with each other. Well, Pope Francis says So the way that we accompany these people is, first of all, we ourselves have to understand we have to have a particular spiritual and religious relationship. We cannot accompany others if we don't certainly first begin by working on ourselves. Accompaniment has a lot to do with listening, which is really difficult, especially for us in the modern world, to listen in a world that can't seem to stop talking. Right? And also that listens with reverence, so that it doesn't automatically hear something and start to be dismissive of it. It's somebody else's story. We listen to it, we honor it. I like the way that Pope Francis talks about listening with all of the senses, coming from a Benedictine place. St. Benedict, in his rule for monasteries, talks about listening with the ear of your heart. Not necessarily the ear of your brain, but the ear of your heart. How do we listen to others with the ear of our heart? How do we find ways to authentically know the person? I'm going to talk about young people in a second. How have we all in this room found ways to authentically know what it's like to be a young person in 2018? Typically, we feel we know the authentic experience of people, of young people, because we used to be young and perhaps we raised some young people. And I can tell you life as a teenager, even a young adult starting a family in 2018 is different than in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s. Right? In some ways it's similar, but in many ways it's different. Do we authentically know what it's like to be a young person right now? Do we know what it's like to be a single parent? Do we know what it's like to be someone who is in a poor spiritual place right now? That doesn't mean we have to go there, but do we understand what that is like so we can listen, so we can walk with, so we can hear authentically instead of to judge out of the gate? And then how exactly do we share teachings, beliefs, personal experiences, etc.? I admit, this drives my wife crazy, so don't tell her that I'm telling you this, but it drives my wife crazy that we live in the country and we get a fair number of door knockers from the local Jehovah's Witness congregation. And like most people, I think, where there's a knock on the door, my wife says, "Oh, no, thank you," and closes the door, right? I feel like I can't do that. Part of that is because I'm, a central Minnesota. Part of it also is I think, my God, you are knocking on doors to directly share your faith. Now, I'm not converting and I let them know I am firm in my faith and this is what I believe, but I will hear you out, because can you imagine if our church required of us to do this? To go and knock on doors and say, I'm going to tell you about the church today, right? I mean, that's a huge thing, and so I always feel like the least I can do is hear them out, right? Drives my wife crazy. But I'm not asking you to go and knock on doors, neither is Pope Francis necessarily. But how do we develop a relationship with people where then we can intentionally share teachings, beliefs, and personal experiences? How do we not just simply lunch with someone and hear them talk about an experience or a question or a challenge? Do we let it go? Or do we start to share teachings, beliefs, personal experiences? Not enabling, but again, helping share that particular good news. And also, how do we trust that God is active? How do we trust that in a situation God is at work and that we help facilitate conversion, facilitate grace, but that we are not responsible for grace? So I want you to think about this for a second. I'm going to give you another seconds to think about it, and I would like you to take 2 minutes to talk about it with someone in you, if you're comfortable with that. So 2 questions. Looking back over your life, who are the people who appeared at the right moment to accompany you so that you could become your most real self? Not people that were just nice, although that's important, but people who had that intentional interaction that helped you orient towards God or hear God's voice. So think back over your life. Who are those people? And the second half is, in your life today, to whom do you turn in those moments when you most need the companionship that assures you, challenges you, and tells you the truth? Not what you want to hear necessarily. Who do you go to if you need to hear the truth? So I want you to think about this for half a minute or so. Okay, now, because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, as you're comfortable, to talk about perhaps one of these questions with somebody at the table. As you're comfortable, again, our emphasis is on listening, on honoring the other person's story. So as you're comfortable to share one or the other response to these questions, I'd invite you to do that now. Again, I'll give you about 2 minutes to discuss the way that the church operates. And because of that, we are both called to be accompanists, but we also have the benefit of having been accompanied. Now, I'm willing to bet a lot of the people that you thought of or perhaps talked about in response to question number 1 would not have thought of themselves as accompanists, right? But what they were doing is what we refer to as accompaniment, right? Now, I gave you this image at the beginning, again, of this singer, right? And I talked about how accompaniment is not enabling. It is not us at the piano enabling the singer to sing whatever they want, right? The score that we have, the song that we've got, has been given to us, right? This is that voice of God, what God is calling us to. Our job as accompanists is to help the singer sing the score. They might sing it a little faster. They might sing it a little slower. They might sing it a lower, a little higher, right? But our goal is to get them to sing the score, not to change it, right? And it's not going to happen right away. I am the kind of person who, when I was in school, and our teachers would say, we're going to do a group project, I would die on the inside because I couldn't stand group projects. Because I was the kind of person who would sit down with my group and I would say, all right, why don't you cut out the letters for the board and, I'll just do that. And why don't you look up some information about I'll just do that, right? I couldn't let go of stuff. It just had to be done the right way and it had to be done now. That is not accompaniment, right? It is difficult when we have people who are maybe family members, maybe parish members, maybe spouses, maybe neighbors, who we feel are not doing what they ought to be, are not doing what they are called to be, to not just go up to them and say, listen here, this is what you need to do right now. We're wired that way a little bit. What accompaniment is, what the church calls us to do, what God calls us to do, is to get us onto the same page, metaphorically speaking, singing the song as written, not editing the song, in a way that is pastoral, in a way that is inviting, in a way that's intentional, in a way that makes room for the Spirit and makes room for grace. Now, one of the big concepts that we have to understand when it comes to accompaniment is this. I grew up being told that conscience is, like Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio, where's the little voice on your shoulder, right? I think that's developed like a confusion of conscience and like schizophrenia ever since. If I'm hearing voices on my shoulders, am I conscience? Do I have a problem? So the conscience in terms of what the church talks about is, again, if God is speaking to us, Scripture, liturgy, nature, others, you name it, right? Teaching of the church. God is also speaking to us through our conscience. So this is from the Joy of Love now, paragraph 37. But Pope Francis, the Synod, writes this. We have long thought that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support. We find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. And this is the kicker. We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. This is the real challenge of accompaniment. If we are to help people cut through the noise, to hear the truth, to hear God's voice, we also have to be open to the way that God, through the Spirit, because of grace, speaks to us through our consciences. Especially if the response is perhaps something other than what I would prefer that response to be. We are not replacing consciences, we're forming them. And that can become difficult. So when I get to the point where we apply this, I think you'll see what I mean. The Catechism. So even beyond Amoris Laetitia, going right to the Catechism. 1782 says, each of us has the right to act in conscience and in freedom, so as personally to make moral decisions. We must not be forced to act contrary to our conscience, nor must we be prevented from acting according to our conscience, especially in religious matters. So this again becomes difficult as we accompany people, and we are trying to make room for grace, to facilitate grace, instead of to form people according to what we want them to hear, or what I want them to do, but to be open to what their conscience, because that's where the voice of God is heard, is calling them to do. Part of me talking about this is helpful because my oldest child is 7, and so when my oldest child starts to get into a phase where we have a little bit more disagreements, we should say, I can go back and I can remember this. Okay, Matt, are we talking about conscience? Are we talking about what I want them to do? Are we talking about what they're called to do? What the voice of God is calling them to do? This is a difficult thing. This is the letting go part of accompanying, and that can be uncomfortable. Also under conscience, again, this is from Amoris Laetitia, we want to direct the pastors of the church to undertake discernment of each case, recognizing that the degree of responsibility is not the same in all cases, and therefore the rules may be applied differently from one case to the next. Now, this is not a free-for-all, right, which I'll say in a second. But what this emphasizes again is the openness to what God is calling people to do, what God's voice is calling people to do, what God's voice is calling people to, as opposed to us assuming that everyone will fit within the same context, the same cookie cutter, the same pace. Morris goes on, a person can come to see that a particular decision is in line with what God himself is asking, amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while not yet fully the objective ideal. It doesn't mean we stop there, but what we're trying to do in accompanying people is to move the needle ever closer towards an orientation towards God. Not to make the leap directly to perfection, but to start to move the needle so that we can constantly be directing people towards the objective ideal, which is, of course, fulfillment of these laws. Again, we'll see this coming through in the application. Right? Move through here, and move through here. So the chief goal of accompaniment is this. We seek to help one another discern the voice of God as it echoes in the depths of our souls. In our conscience, it's God who speaks to us. Not even the church, although the church certainly helps us understand what God is saying. Not our spouse, not even ourselves. This is how we're facilitating this coming through. This is what our approach towards accompaniment, our understanding of the way conscience works happens. Now, I want us to keep in mind that there are two extremes here. And we have to find the balance between the two. Right? So one is an overly law-centered approach to conscience. So this would say that we form our consciences only to be in accordance with the law, never reaching any other conclusion. So the problem with this, the church would say, these documents would say, Francis uses the phrase, we become remote controlled by the church. Right? What we're doing is inviting people towards the freedom of choice, not to remote control people as though they're pawns on the game board. Right? In that case, it means our conscience would not matter, which means that that is not within our tradition as Catholics. On the other side, the other extreme is being overly self-centered. This is the permissiveness. I don't feel like God is calling me to go to church. I don't feel like God is calling me to get married. I don't feel like God is calling me to, etc. Right? Well, this would be a problem because we would try to justify all of our own voice as that being God's voice. And that is not the case. Right?
We can't make decisions without adequate prayer discernment. The church teaches that we are obligated to follow our consciences if they are formed consciences. Not just the little voice told me not to go to church today does not count. Right? So if we ignore Scripture or church teaching or common sense, we develop the other end of things, which is overly self-centered. So accompaniment opens the door. It's uncomfortable because it calls us to live in the gray sometimes, to listen, to help process, to break open, to struggle with people as they seek to find the voice of God in the messiness of their daily lives. When we prefer things to be black and white and neat and just do this, if you follow these things, everything's going to be great. Well, we're not permissive, we're not overly law-centered, we need to find a way straight through the middle. This also would not be within our tradition. This affirming, this enabling, this appeasement is not within our Catholic tradition. Alright, so one final note on formation, and then I want to talk about implications, and I've mentioned a couple of times that we're going to apply this to a situation for the purpose of clarity. So, the Catechism says the following. In the formation of conscience, the Word of God is the light for our path. We must also examine our conscience before the Lord's cross. We're assisted by the gifts of the Holy Spirit, aided by the witness or advice of others, and guided by the authoritative teaching of the Church. But when it comes down to it, conscience is the way that God speaks to us. It's just sometimes our voice sounds a lot like God's voice in our hearing. We have to figure that out. So, what that means is, as accompanists, we need to learn to withhold our own imposition of what we prefer. We need to allow others to hear the voice of God, not to permit them to think their own voice is the voice of God, but to allow them to hear the true voice of God as it echoes in their own hearts. To offer others the same mercy, essentially, that we ourselves have received. And that can be a challenge. This is also a, again, renewed paradigm in ministry. This is not a new paradigm in ministry. So what I want to do is give you a situation. So all of these somewhat abstract ideas that are floating around, we can start to think about how we would or should apply them. Right? Most famously, in Pope Francis's writings, especially in Amoris Laetitia, the conversation about accompaniment has been around the issue of reception of communion by divorced remarried Catholics. To some extent, it gets into issues of family planning, or people in irregular situations, as the document calls it. And I think those are important considerations, but I want to give you a different application rather than those. So I am going to put up the question for reflection for our application, and then I'm going to give you time to get another cookie and to replenish your coffee, because I'm told that a break is always good. And then we will apply these concepts of what accompaniment is, how it works, how the conscience sort of forms a kicker here, to this initial question. Okay? So I'm going to put up the question, and we'll take 5-ish minutes or so for a break to stretch your legs, and then we'll get into the application. So here's the question. Can you identify a young person or a young adult who has disaffiliated from the Catholic Church? What I mean by that is someone who no longer claims membership in the church. Someone who was a member, grew up in the church, but who no longer considers himself to be Catholic. So can you identify that person? Maybe someone you know personally, maybe someone you know well, maybe someone in your family, or someone you know of. So just take a second, recall their first name, what factors, experiences, or events may have contributed to that disaffiliation. I'll leave this here. You can continue to consider it. We've got about 5 minutes or so. Is that right, Kim? About 5 minutes or so to get coffee, cookies. We're going to feel what needs to happen is not happening. And we need to be open to the possibility of the presence of grace. And also we need to be able to hear God's voice. Here's something that happens quite often in parishes that I see. a couple comes to get married, and they're asked to fill out the forms, and they happen to have the same address. Right? What do we do? Right? It's common, right? Now, this is where accompaniment gets to be difficult, because accompaniment is difficult. It's easy to say, no cohabitation, come back once you have separate addresses, right? The response at one point in our history would have been, maybe they would have moved, or at least they would have, like, said, yeah, I live here, but don't, right? They'd have the good sense to lie about it or something, right? Now the reality is, they don't come back. So the question is, how in a moment like that can we accompany? Not that we can say, you know what, new rule, go ahead and cohabitate. That's not what accompaniment says. What accompaniment says is, how do we maintain that relationship? How do we figure out who these people are, help them figure out who we are, help them understand what the voice of God is calling them to, what the truth of that voice is calling them to, and then walking with them as they start to move that needle to again be in alignment with what that ideal is that we require them to. It's that commitment to walking with. It's the developing the slow churn towards perfection instead of expecting immediate perfection. Because God only knows there's going to be few blessings, but all of a sudden we're expecting immediate perfection. So that's the type of situation, it's the type of pastoral situation or family situation we're talking about. How do we struggle with that? How do we continue to engage? The self-centered side of things would say, go ahead and live together, that's just fine. The overly law-centered side of things would say, no, get out of here, don't come back until. What's that middle way? How do we walk? So, I'm going to talk very briefly here, because we don't have a whole lot of time left, about the reality of young people in the church right now. And what I want to suggest is that, and this is not a post-mortem here, right? I'm not assigning causes or blame. But it's my contention that part of our problem, part of our quote-unquote youth problem in the church, is because we have not been fundamentally oriented towards accompaniment in the past, as oriented as we could be. But our solution, quote-unquote, if there is such a thing, to this reality, is in accompaniment. So here's some of the information. Really quickly, there is a Christian anthropologist by the name of Christopher Dawson. He's a British anthropologist. And as he studied the history of the church, he's identified what he calls 6 ages of the church. So he divides church history up into these 6 ages. And one of the common features he points out is that each of these ages are about 300 to 400 years. Each one begins and ends with some sort of crisis. Each crisis is brought on by some sort of intensity within or without the church. And the response, how we move from crisis into a new age, requires some sort of new spiritual drive or determination. So the questions, now I'm talking about young people, could be talking about a lot of stuff right now, right? But I'm talking about young people, so there's a lot of thinkers, a lot of anthropologists that have talked about the fact that they think we might be at the beginning of a new, quote-unquote, 7th age within the church. Because it seems like the factors are right about now. So here are the indicators. By 2050, only 1 Christian out of 5, this is Christians, not just Catholics, but 1 Christian out of 5 will be a non-Latino white person. That's less a comment about others than it is about ourselves, right? Or the typical, what we have known to be true about the demographics of the church. The center of gravity, of course, is shifting to the southern hemisphere. The church Christianity does grow every year by the numbers because of South America, because of Africa, because of parts of Asia. Not at all because of North America or because of Europe, right? Despite North America and Europe, the church is growing. We are losing Christian communities in the ancestral home of Christianity. We've been watching the terrible things that have been happening in ISIS, in Syria, other things. There are villages and cities in the Middle East that have had a Christian presence since Jesus himself who no longer have Christians, or have very few, and will likely not have Christians in the very near future. We have a rethinking about what it means to be human, because our experience of being human is different. We have new challenges, new realities that we didn't face before. So, the most profound change, perhaps, that people point to is within our culture. Sometimes this is referred to as the second fall, right? The first one being Adam. Some refer to this cultural shift as being the second fall. And I'm not talking about like kooky culture stuff, right? I mean, this is a statistical, societal analysis here, right? Atheism is no longer the enemy. I shouldn't say no longer the enemy as though like it doesn't exist, right? But it used to be, we need to take a stand against atheism. That isn't necessarily our number one concern any longer. It's functional atheism. And what I mean by that is this. The surveys that are being done now, of all people, but especially young people, show that not only are people becoming more secularized, they are not thinking about religion whatsoever. It's not a matter of rejecting religion. You know, when we think about even 20, 30 years ago, there was a big push against atheism, and atheists are trying to... It's not, I am standing up and rejecting religion. It's, I'm not even considering it at all. I'm ignoring it completely. It's not a factor whatsoever. This is a big shift. In fact, for the first time in about 2 millennia, there's a lot of scholars who would agree that we are moving towards a post-Christian era, at least in parts of the world. Meaning, we've gotten to the point where the presence and activity and assumed relationship with the church is now going to be a thing of the past because of the trends. That tends to be because of this group. You've heard of these people, perhaps? The nuns, not the N-U-N-S's, but the N-O-N-E-S's. The group of people who do not claim any religious affiliation whatsoever. So these are not the outspoken atheists. These are the, what religion am I? I guess I never really thought about it. I don't really have one. That's becoming the norm. So I'm going to give you a passage here that is statistic rich. I'm going to give you the bad news before I give you the good news, right? It's just, there's more slides of bad news than... but here it is, right? In the 30s and 40s, those who claimed no religious affiliation whatsoever, I'm talking about all Christians here, were about 5%. 50, 60 years later, we're up to 8%. That's not so bad. But between 1990 and 2008, that doubles from 8% to 15%. And then 4 years after that, we're at 20%. So 1 out of every 5 Americans, as of 2012, or for adults under the age of 30, 1 out of every 3 people, does not claim any sort of religious affiliation. Not, I'm a former Catholic, or anything like that, just I don't have any affiliation whatsoever. But it gets a little worse, because that was 2012. And if you look at since then, between 2012 and 2014, in just 2 years' time, we went from almost 20% to 23%, or 1 out of every 4 adults in the United States currently claims no religious affiliation. 70 years ago, it was 5-ish%. Now it's 1 out of every 4 adults. The nuns are the largest religious group in the United States. Following the nuns is Christians, and among Christians, Catholics were still number 1 in terms of membership. The second largest Christian denomination in the United States after Catholics is former Catholics. There are more former Catholics than there are non-Catholic Christians in the United States. I promise it'll get a little bit better. At the same time, we have shrinking Christian populations. So 80% to 71% in the last decade, people who profess themselves to be Christians. Largely, that's because of people dying out. Congregations dying out. People who are professing Christians passing away and not being replaced by other professing Christians. Right? Again, of the 85% American adults who were raised Christian, a quarter of them have left. Former Christians are 20% of the U.S. population overall. There are more than 4 former Christians for every convert to Christianity. This is all Christian denominations. This is not just Catholic, but we are certainly reflective of these statistics also. Okay? And it's happening across every demographic. So, every year, the nuns grow more secular. What I mean by that is, every year the number who seem to have some residual religiosity, that starts to decrease over time. So again, the past 7 years, nuns who believe in God or pray is in decline. It used to be higher, it's slowly whittling away. And no wonder. How can you pray or believe in God if you have no association or formation? And again, these aren't people who say, I don't believe in God, I reject prayer. It's people who don't consider it. It's never occurred to them because it's never been formed or taught. Oftentimes. 89% of adults say they believe in God, but only 63% say they're absolutely certain. Now, I'm not here to say that doubt is a bad thing or that doubt is a problem. We can work with doubt. Right? But the formation is what's whittling things away here. Okay? So, the younger you get, the more secularization increases. 6 out of 10 baby boomers pray every day, but only 4 in 10 quote-unquote young millennials. That's people, I'm a millennial. I'm like at the beginning of the millennial group, which I know millennials are the worst, and I apologize for that. But I'm an older millennial, so I'm 36, so younger millennials are probably about 30. Somewhere in there, late 20s, mid-30s, 4 in 10 only say they pray every day, right? Nearly half of our population qualify as post-Christian. Again, an abandonment of religion altogether. I find this to be shocking on the face value, but think about what this means in terms of formation. 62% of Americans reported, they might have been lying, but probably not, reported that they attended church, quote-unquote, frequently in 1994. Think about what going to church, quote-unquote, means for a Christian. It means belonging to community. It means formation, both liturgically, it means through scripture, through other study, through things like this, right? 62%. In 2013, less than half claimed they attended seldom or never. So not only did we drop to less than half, but it's not even frequently. Like, we can't even get to half who say they go at least seldom or never. All Christians. Catholics are a little higher in this regard, sort of. But of all Christians, it's a little less than half. Okay? Oh, this is also what should be worrying parishes most. Well, all of this is worrisome, but decline in attendance is also matched with a decline in membership, somewhat for the first time. It used to be, well, people are members of the parish, they just never come to Mass. We know that, right? That's not a surprise. We know that for a long time. Now it's not a matter of there are members on the books and not showing up. They're not showing up and they're not members whatsoever. That's been a real shift. We were sort of not okay with, but we could work with the, you're a member and you come at Christmas time and that's when we'll get you. It doesn't happen at all anymore. There's no membership to go along with that. So, sociologists attribute this to what's called the squishy center, which is descriptive. So, there are 3 forces that are kind of contributing to this post-Christianity, according to some researchers. One of them is secularization. So, we are becoming more secular because the sectors of society and culture are being removed from the influence of religion. So, religion is not having as much influence in our overall popular culture. Right? Privatization, we no longer think of faith as a communal thing or as something that we share. It's private. Right? only discuss the weather, right? Never ask anybody about their health or religion kind of thing. I don't want to talk about my faith, that's a private matter. Well, it can be a private matter, and however I ascribe it, if it's not something that's shared in community, it's easy to unattach. And then pluralization. There are more options, there are more ideologies, there are more messages that compete for our attention and compete for our understanding and our consideration as truth. Now, I'm going to say something about secularization because I tend to not fret too much about secularization, provided there's something else to fill the gap. And I'll show you what I mean here in a graph here. Privatization and pluralization, I think, are bigger deals than secularization. So these forces, secularization, there's less context for faith. Privatization, all things are private if they relate to faith. And pluralization, all worldviews are equally valid. All of the voices I hear are equally truthful. Not just there's one voice and it's God and there's somewhere in the noise. No, everything seems to be perfectly legitimate. So here's the graph. So if you consider our population, if you consider, and this is not the actual percentage, but let's just, for sake of argument, say that 25% of people are purely secular. Don't participate in religion, have antipathy towards religion, or atheist, whatever it might be. 25% are secularists. And 25% are believers. Well, that leaves 50% of people who are in the squishy center. And what the squishy center means is, or what's happened that's changed things, is before, when faith was more public, when it was less pluralistic, when there was less secularism and things were more present in the culture, there was something to kind of bump people or edge them in the squishy center towards belief. In other words, if you did not ever talk about faith at home as a child, there were other things that you could see or witness that told you about faith. You would know people pray before meals because you turn on the TV set and see people in television shows or movies praying before meals. You would know something about the very, very basics, very minimum, because it would direct you there. Right? I'll give you an example of the squishy center at work. Did anybody watch Downton Abbey when it was on? If you haven't, go home right now and watch that. Right? Downton Abbey was this, not literally right now, but in a few minutes. Downton Abbey was this program on PBS that was painstakingly accurate portrayal of life in the early part of the 20th century in aristocratic Edwardian England, right? When we're one or so. Painstakingly accurate. The producers of Downton Abbey, now I am not casting aspersion here, but I want to tell you about the effect of this. The producers of Downton Abbey decided to not show this aristocratic family's religiosity at all. Assuredly, if you were an aristocratic family in Britain in the 19-teens and 1920s, you would have gone to church. Even if you weren't a believer, you would have gone, because that was societally expected. So when this show that is so accurate, painstakingly accurate, down to the right buttons, right, and the costumes, they never portray the family, rarely portray the family, only if there's a wedding in a church or something, actually praying. Because there were enough people who are not religious who were watching the show, they didn't want to cause offense. All right, however we feel about that, that's just the way that it is. So what they do is, every scene where they're about to sit down to dinner, when they would pray, that's where the scene ends, or the scene begins with them already seated at the table having dinner. So they can avoid the, well, we have to show them praying now, I guess, right? So the effect of things like that is, the people in the squishy center don't get bumped this way by one more example of seeing people pray before meals. Oh, that's a thing that you do, I guess. And instead, there's just no association whatsoever that we pray before meals. There's no association whatsoever about a lot of the cultural examples of faith that we take for granted. Right? And it even happens among practicing people. Now, I'm not saying that these things are as important as other aspects of faith, right? It's amazing to me the number of friends I have who bring their kids to church who don't necessarily know about Advent wreaths, St. Nicholas, certain practices during Lent, like how we fast or how we don't fast, different ritual actions or things of different types of liturgies, because they don't know, they've never been formed. And so that squishy center that's just out there floating, it's kind of like keeping a balloon in the air, right? Well, if we don't have momentary bumps to keep it on this side of belief, it drifts towards non-belief, because there's nothing there to inform, right? So, really quickly, because I know that we don't have a lot of time left. For Catholics, most Catholic youth leave before age 21. It's actually a lot worse than that, I'll show you guys. About half become completely unaffiliated. The other half of Catholic youth who leave Catholic churches attend other Christian denominations. So about half leave us, still stay within Christianity, about half leave and aren't affiliated with anything at all. You can see again, overall percentages of millennials. There's about 5.4 million former Catholics aged 15 to 25. 5.4 million kids in high school and college who at one point were considered Catholic, who are not. I'm not talking about, again, the Catholic kid who got through confirmation and doesn't show up to Mass anymore. I'm talking about the Catholic kid who, when asked, what's your religious affiliation, does not check the Catholic box, checks none. Right? 5.4 million. You can see it's trending younger. 2007, 31%. Now 2014, 35%. So again, as the older generations who believe are moving on to eternal reward, that space is being filled with younger generations. And again, I'm 36. If I'm one of the 40% of people my age who don't have any religious affiliation, what are the odds my 4 children have any religious affiliation? Right? So it perpetuates as time goes on. This is something that is scary. All of these things that are Catholic markers, here are the realities for the last 20 years or so. Infant baptisms are down 30%. Funerals within the church are down 14%. That will significantly increase as time goes on. Because increasingly, people who are members of parishes who are dying, their children who may or may not be affiliated with the church are making burial decisions, and if they're not affiliated with the church, oftentimes don't make burial decisions in the church. Right? Certainly we know secondary elementary school enrollment is dropping. Annulments are down. That's good. Except marriages are also down. So of course annulments are down if there aren't marriages to annul, if you think of it in that sort of way, right? There is one thing that's up, of course, and that's former Catholics. So here's the crux, and then we'll talk about the solution. I mentioned this before. Without an orientation toward the desire of God for us, we quickly become drifters in a world lacking meaning. We are seeing drifters in a world lacking meaning. The world does not lack meaning. We don't know how to find it. We've been cut loose from all of these other associations that help us form that meaning and help us understand things, right? So my question is, and my challenge is, I'm skipping through all these, this one, I do want to put up. Here are causes that people indicated in surveys. We surveyed former Catholics or disaffiliated young people. St. Mary's did a big study. Dr. Bob McCarty, who's originally from Minnesota, did this. These were common causes. Take a look at this list of 8 causes. Does not believe in God or religion, parent or family issues, changed or converted to another religion, is opposed to the Catholic Church or religious institutions, has specific issues with specific church teachings, just drifted away, the parish wasn't welcoming, or clergy sexual abuse. Of these, what do you think the top 3 are? Take a second, think about it. What do you think the top 3 reasons are in this list of 8? They're exactly in order. The top 3 were the first 3. The least reported one were the last couple. Now here's the problem though. I almost become more concerned by the absence of people having a problem with the bottom view, because clergy sexual abuse crisis, parish is not welcoming to me. My parish isn't welcoming because I never go there. How could I even have a poor experience of being welcomed in my parish if I'm not there? Right? The church, we oftentimes, those of us who have lived through scandal and crisis in the church, and it's hard for us, forget that if I'm an 18-year-old, I've never known a church that hadn't been racked by the sexual abuse crisis. So we think about a church that has lost credibility For young people, they live in a church that has, in their lifetime, never had it. So how could they report that as a reason for leaving? Because they didn't lose credibility or faith in the church if they never had it in the first place. That's concerning. Right? So out of all of these things, if we think about this, look at some of the responses, and I know I'm over time here and I apologize for that, but look at some of these responses. There are three types of categories of people who leave. The drifters. I didn't really have an association with that parish to begin with. These are actual quotes. I believe there could be a God, but I'm not really sure. I can't really prove that there's one, so I don't belong. My parents stopped making me go, so I had no say. I didn't want to, or not want to receive confirmation. I just kind of went with it. It didn't really matter to me one way or another. My family stopped going, so I didn't go. My parents stopped making me go. I had no desire to go. These are actual responses from people who have disaffiliated. We are blessed to have this information, because every single one of these quotes that you see was an opportunity, is still an opportunity for accompaniment. It's easy to say, you stopped believing, or you didn't show up, or whatever it might be, and you're gone, and that's it. A smaller but purer church would be best. Maybe. But we have all these opportunities. I believe there could be a God, I'm not entirely sure. Where's the formation? Where's the commitment to have that conversation, to investigate this and discover it, and have real conversations theologically and spiritually? That's what Barb needed. Barb still might need. Are we equipped for that? This is Holly from Nebraska. Catholicism was forced on me as a young child. I have a friend who went to middle school, introduced me to another denomination. I got interested in that, and those people, that's what caused me to leave. I didn't consider myself religious until I switched denominations. Because she had a different experience somewhere else that we did not provide, or parish did not provide. An accompanying experience. Youth ministers don't have to wear skinny jeans and play the electric guitar and talk like they're 15 in order to get young people involved. Right? They need to be welcomed and be accompanied, because that's what they're finding elsewhere. Sometimes we look at, in my part of the country, my part of the state, we have Assembly of God churches that are like siphoning off Catholic young people left and right, if they're going to another denomination at all. And oftentimes people say, well, they have a bounce house and a ping pong table in the basement. That's why kids are going. No, that's not why they're going. It's nice, but they're going because people there know them and accompany them, and they happen to have a bounce house and a ping pong table. Right? Really quickly, the others. Dissenters. There are those who have active resistance to the church, to be sure. I believe in birth control. I had sex when I was like 17. I'm a complete supporter of gay marriage and being able to choose who you want to be with. Diane. Okay. What was our response, or what could our response be to that? There are others out there. Is that well, you didn't pass the litmus test, so you can have no association or welcome or belonging? We're not going to be permissive. We're not going to be enabling and say, tell us what church teachings you happen to disagree with, and we just won't talk about those. That's not what we're going to have. But how do we have conversations to open the door for discovery, to find where the voice of God is, instead of closing off the conversation and saying, well, Diane, get out? Or allowing Diane to say, well, then I can't be there. This one makes me crazy. I disagree with the literal interpretation and use of the Bible. Guess what? So do we. Right? This is the one that makes me crazy. Right? The points where people make a false assumption about what the church does or does not do, that's because they heard a message wrong. They were formed to believe something that is not true. And the reason they left was something that's not real. Where's the opportunity for accompaniment there? And then the injury to the damage. This is a difficult pastoral sensibility. Right? I was in 5th grade when my uncle died, and he was in his 40s. How can something like that happen to someone so young? Why do bad things happen to good people type thing? Was the reason Diane left. They are too closed-minded, hypocritical, and self-serving. I don't want a friend like that. Why would I want to have a church like that? Are we closed-minded, hypocritical, self-serving? I don't think so. I mean, I hope that. If we are, then we have some other problems. But we aren't in a position to have these conversations in a way that accompanies, that doesn't feel like the judgmental friend that Diane is talking about? How do we walk with people? How do we accompany them? How do we not just take them out to lunch and pat them on the head and say, thanks for coming to Donut Sunday, isn't community great? How do we intentionally invest in people? Because I maintain that the reason these young people left the church, sure, some might have left, they're listening to things that are not of God, perhaps. But I also think along the way, there were opportunities for accompaniment that was not there, was not provided, was not accessed. It's so hard to accompany, but this is what happens when it's not present, right? Last thing, common factors. For most young people, most people who leave the church, there's some event or series of events that trigger a process of questioning or doubting. Accompaniment can work with that, right? Let's see if anyone through these. They have a sense of being happy and free or relieved by their decision to disaffiliate with the church. I actually feel okay having a detachment from the church. It's a little weight taken off my shoulder. Accompaniment can challenge that and say, what is that voice? Is that true? Is that you? Is that something else? Is that the world? What is that voice telling you? Congratulations, you've left, and that's good. We can challenge that. They feel religion was forced on them, and they will not force it on their children. That means they didn't have a formation in the right way. They didn't understand why things were happening. Why are we doing this? Just be quiet and do that. It's not going to develop a lifelong relationship or understanding, right? So how are we forming people so it's not this sense of forcedness? They see themselves as moral and committed, but they think, I can be ethical without religion. I consider myself a good person, not religious or spiritual, just a good person. Can we answer this question, why faith is important? Do we have an answer for that? Someone asked us, why is faith important? Why can't I just be a good person? I don't know what I would say to that necessarily, right? But we need those types of answers in accompaniment. Whether they still somewhat believe or disbelieve in God or something bigger, they are not closed to belief if an argument or evidence can be presented. Now, this is a different approach, but the good news is the majority of those who have disaffiliated, who have not had an experience of accompaniment, are open to experiences of accompaniment. We have an opportunity. A lot of work, we have to retool everything. We have to be open to not doing things the way we've done them before because of this. But we have the door that's open. As time goes on, every year, every generation, every new batch of kids is becoming further and further disaffiliated. So we kind of are racing against the clock a little bit. The last thing I want to say. Here's my story. There's a guy. It's always a guy. And he lives in a house who's in a floodplain. There's a radio broadcast, floods are coming. It's going to be really bad, everyone needs to evacuate. And he says, I'm a person of faith, I pray, I go to church, God will protect me. So I'm going to stay. The flood waters come and they start to rise. Goes up to the second floor of his house as the waters are rising. And a person comes along in a rowboat, a woman comes along in a rowboat and says, hey, come on, hop in the rowboat, the waters are rising. He says, no, I'm a good person, I go to church, I pray, a person of faith, God will save me. The water's rising a little higher, so now he's up on the roof. The rowboat is passed, and a helicopter comes by and says, get over helicopter. And he says, no, he waves him off. I'm a person of faith, I pray, I believe in God, God will save me. He drowns. He gets to heaven. There he is, face to face with God. He said, how could this happen? I'm a person of faith, I pray, I went to church, you didn't save me. And God says, I sent you a radio broadcast, I sent you a woman in a lifeboat. I sent you someone in a helicopter. What else did you need? What are you doing here? This is the impetus and the implication for all of us as people of faith. This is the last thing. We believe God speaks. Who are the people in the radio broadcast, the lifeboat, the helicopters for us? That's one consideration. But how are we the radio broadcast, the lifeboat, and the helicopter pilots for others? If you look at Teresa Avila's famous, prayer of Christ has no hands now but ours, no voice but ours, no feet but ours. Ours are the hands that do the work of Christ in the world. We get used to answer prayer. We are vehicles and vessels to answer prayer, to allow this grace of God to come through. We facilitate grace, we don't dispense it. So what are the ways that we can allow ourselves to be opened up, to be these people, to be the accompanists for those who need it most? Whether it be young people, people in irregular situations, divorced, remarried, you name it. How do we do that and not close it off because of our resistance or our hesitancy or our judgment? Really difficult thing, but that's exactly where we are as a church and what we're being called to do. We're equipped to accompany, which is great news. God is speaking, God is working, that is great news. That's what's hopeful about all these statistics. They're open, but then it's our job to now respond. That was a lot of stuff, really fast. And I apologize for that. And I know we're over time, but I'd be really happy to facilitate any questions that you might have.
One of the things that strikes me when you're talking about like this moving needle and how we're like moving towards alignment and the idea of, well, and I think of like the couple coming into the pastor's office to get married, and how are you going to accompany them when, especially I think accompanying requires a certain level of trust.
Mm-hmm.
How do you develop that relationship and create that environment where there is that trust that is built that takes time?
Especially when we are working against false perceptions or assumptions because of people's prior experiences. People assume that the church is in a situation of being judgmental and off-putting. Even within the church, sometimes we assume that. And that just is not further from the truth. So how do we overcome that perception? How do we build trust? I think that's significant. I think we start building trust by understanding our own assumptions, awarenesses. One of the things, and this is St. John Paul II has talked about this, there are areas of the Catechism that talk about this, about can someone sin, or can it be counted a sin if someone errs through ignorance? The answer is no, all other things being equal. We're in a situation now, especially with younger people, and now we're like 40 and younger, right? We're considering younger people. Where there are people who will come in to get married who never knew they shouldn't be cohabitating. How do we respond to that? We hold them accountable for something they didn't know. It's a difficult thing, right? What this is for trust is a matter of how do we receive people to try to understand what their situation is and what their lives are, so that we can begin to find out where the needle is in the first place and what the first couple of clicks are, right? That's where the trust is, as I think it starts with ourselves. The fact that anybody who is a young, and I know I'm just talking about young people, the fact that there's anybody who's a young person coming to our parishes for something right now, we should like knock each other over to try to do everything we can, right? This is where I also get down to you have to understand what it's like to be the person that you're accompanying. I don't say this to be controversial, but a political example. My students I have in college right now are, 18 to 20 or so, because I teach primarily first and second year students. There has never been a point in their lifetimes, while they've been aware of what's going on in the world, where Donald Trump has never been a politician. I use that example to say, we all think of things like, okay, well now he's a politician, and before that he was just a real estate tycoon, but now this is different. And their worldview is so different than ours because they don't have the same history, right? So I use that as an example to say, all of my college students were born after Google was created. All of my students have been born, they have no recollection of life before September 11, 2001. They have never lived in the United States that was not at war in the Middle East. Right? So as you start to think about these things, that doesn't change the reality of the situation they find themselves in, but it changes a little bit of the way that you would respond to them or receive where they are and start to put them on the right path, right? So it's a long, complicated way to say it. I think the trust begins by receiving the desire earnestly and authentically and trying to authentically understand, yet still move that needle. Not to be permissive, but also to be gentle, essentially. It gets much more complicated when you deal with bigger moral issues, right? But the structure is still.
What is the attraction to the young people in the mega churches? And we are losing, if they do speak, and maybe that's not really a loss, but if they continue to remain a Christian, not remaining Catholic.
The root of it is accompaniment, or at least a perception of accompaniment, right? So let me give you this example. Dr. Bob McCarty, he used to be the executive director for the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry. He co-authored a study at St. Mary's Press called Going, Going, Gone, The Growing Disaffiliation of Young Catholics. Great book through St. Mary's Press. I highly recommend it. He talks about this a lot. Think about any ad you've seen recently for a fitness center or a gym. If you look at like 24-hour fitness, their ad is something like this. The place, or something like, you can show up and not be afraid of judgment. Sort of this idea, we don't judge you and we miss you when you're gone. This is from a gym. That's the general sense that sometimes other denominations, other faiths, other megachurches can give, is that perception of belonging. We used to have the structure within the church. Consider how parishes operated and people's affiliation with the church progressed a couple generations ago. Because you were Catholic, you joined the parish and you became a member of the community and eventually felt you belonged. That's completely opposite for people now. I need to feel a sense of belonging, which will lead me to a sense of believing. Not a sense of believing leading to a sense of belonging. And so I think the attraction to megachurches is, and actually some of the data that's starting to come out now suggests people who leave the church and go to another denomination actually then end up, they're sort of split into thirds. A third becomes nuns, a third stays in that denomination, and a third come back. Because there's the perception of belonging. How do you belong to a megachurch? If I go to a service with 20,000 people, eventually, how do I feel like I belong? At the beginning, it might be flashy enough that I feel like I do. But at some point, if I don't have a sense of belonging, I'm out. That's why we have people leaving our church, oftentimes. There's not that sense of belonging. I don't feel like people know me. If I'm not here, I don't think people would notice. I don't have an authentic way to be involved. And we are still operating with the practices that used to work. I work with a lot of musicians and directors of music. Is anybody the director of music with me, right? Okay, then I can pick on. Here's the invitation. So I run a summer program that takes place at St. John's, but it's a national program. It's called the One Call Institute. And our goal is to try to take young people, high school and college, who are musically inclined, and get them involved in their parish music ministry because we need it, but also by extension to find that belonging so they remain faithful in their parish. It's a little bit of a trick. Don't tell them that's what we're up to. But I will have people who call me and say, I would love to come to your program, but I can't find any young people in my parish. I say, like, you have no young people in their parish? They're like, well, nobody who's involved. And I say, well, did you invite them? Well, sure. I put it in the bulletin, and at the end of Mass, I said, anybody wants to come to choir practice, it's tomorrow night at 7. Who reads the bulletin? I mean, we might. I don't. Right? It's not a thing that most younger people do. And also, if I'm not there at Mass to hear the announcements, how am I going to go? Right? So our way of, we think we're inviting, we think we're providing belonging, but we're not understanding what belonging means through the lens of the people we're trying to get involved. They think they find it elsewhere. Sometimes they do, oftentimes they don't. Did you ever see the movie Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy, my favorite actor of all time? All right, after you go home and watch Downton Abbey, you watch it. In Inherit the Wind, Spencer Tracy's character tells this story about when he was a kid, growing up in a poor family, and he walked by the toy store every day. In the window was this shiny gold rocking horse. Shiny gold, blue spots, red tail, the whole thing, and just covered. He wanted this thing, but he knew his family couldn't afford it. Every day he'd walk by twice and stare at it, sadly. He wanted this horse. And he woke up on the morning of his birthday, and there at the end of his bed was the rocking horse. Dad worked extra shifts, saved the money, bought it for him. He was so excited, he ran and he jumped on the horse, broke into two, because it was rotten all the way through. Right? There was the glitz, but the inner core didn't hold it. I am not suggesting whatsoever that mega churches are all glitz and rotten to the core. It's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting is sometimes our perception of what something is turns out to not match our experience of it once we have it. How do we facilitate belonging that means something to the people who are desperately searching it? All of the research shows people get involved in things that we wish they would not get involved in because they desperately seek belonging. We are here in a parish community where they are already members. And they're not here because they don't feel like they belong to a group that is already theirs. So we have to try and align our understanding of belonging with theirs. Does that make sense? That's a lot more than what you bargained for. Maybe one more question? Yes, please.
Yeah, just a comment on accompaniment, or I guess it's kind of a definitional thing, but accompaniment, as we originally talked about it, and just the word in English to me has kind of a one-on-one connotation. But if you look at the second proposition, how one deals with people that are or need to perhaps expand their spirituality and their religion, I think there is an accompaniment. It sounds like the wrong word, but that needs to come a lot more from media and social media and so on. I don't know that there's enough one-on-one mentors to mentor the people that perhaps need to hear more, so that until there is more Downton Abbey producers that are willing to sneak spirituality or religious affiliation and in a positive way back into media, until there are websites, blogs, and so on that do more than promote clothes or specific political views. I think it needs to happen, and that, I mean, the word almost sounds distorted or out of its definition when you say that there's a vast media need for accompaniment.
Sure. Well, I think all the research tells us that one of the, this is a cluster of things, this is not a singular thing, but a cluster of things that on the rise almost universally in every part of the country for people who are age 35 and younger are rises of issues related essentially to fundamental loneliness. Loneliness is through the roof for young people. At a time when we are more connected than ever. Loneliness is there. Why? Because I can have 5,000 Facebook friends, but it doesn't mean I feel a connection to anybody, right? So, what does connection mean? What does relationship mean? Here's again, not to beat the rocking horse here, but the same thing as before. When we talk about friendship or relationship, we understand that to be something different than someone who might be 15 or 16 and for 8 or 9 years has been using social media. And so their understanding of what the word friend or relationship means is completely different than ours. Now, whether we think that's sad or too bad, it just is that way, right? The word accompaniment, of course, suggests the word companion. The Latin roots of companion, com with, in panis is bread. someone with whom you break bread, right? Now again, that's not just taking people out to lunch, but think about that intimacy of breaking bread with a person, sitting down with them. That type of relationship that you're describing that we don't have is exactly what people are thirsting for. There is a group of people out there who are hungry for belonging, authentic relationship, where they can be fully known and they can know others. And they have no concept of religion. We have the antidote in spades. And now we have, while we are at the same time having hemorrhaged a group of people, we also have exactly what all the research is suggesting people who feel lonely in modern society are craving and looking for. It's a way of matching those things up. That's going to be the billion-dollar idea, which you have 10 minutes to buy your life. Last question.
Yeah, just quick I think we do have the mentors. I don't know how many Catholics there are. Maybe there's 20, 60 million Catholics in the United States. If one Catholic accompanied one person for 2 years, like they used to do in the very old church, when somebody came in, they stayed with, usually were accompanied for about a couple of years with a Christian to learn about the faith and journey with them and get to know things. So in 2 years, theoretically, you could maybe double that population of Catholics. And then another 2 years, you could double that just by having one. It's just by having one person they accompany one other person.
Sure.
So I mean, we tend to think so big, but sometimes just one-on-one is more effective and can have long-term positive results.
Absolutely, and that requires us to reclaim what our heritage is, as you described. It also requires us as people in the pews to think about our job, our vocation as practicing Catholics is something different than perhaps what it used to be. Oftentimes, we think of, well, the person who's supposed to go out there and set everybody straight is the person who wears a collar, who gets paid by the church, right? And while that might be true in certain circumstances, we're also, the harvest is truly plentiful. The laborers aren't necessarily few, we just don't necessarily know that the crop is ripe and that we're the laborers, right? We need to be equipped with how to. But I mean, you're right, if we can link this thing up, it's significant. I mean, it's there. It looks like doom and gloom when you look at the numbers. I didn't put up the visuals of graphs because all of the trends lines it's really bad. But it's not, I see this as hopeful because we've got what's needed. People just don't know that we've got it, and we don't know how to present it and deliver it and execute it in a way that's authentically us, authentically of God, and that other people understand. But that's why I really do hope you continue with this process of accompaniment, because I talk a little bit about it, but I mean, what do I know? I'm just some guy from Collegeville. There's so much more to it and depth to it and processes and what it might look like and what do we do about certain situations and how can we engage parish teams and how can we tell other people about it and and they tell two people and those people tell two people, etc. There's a lot that's there and a lot that's to be written. So I hope you do continue. Sorry, I know I kept you late. Now you have 6 minutes to go on my way. Thank you all very much.